Good evening. I hope that people can see me. This is the book release lecture that I gave 2 weeks ago on August 26th, and now we are sharing it with our international audience on the Norwegian Immigration Museum's website. So I would first like to thank the editors of the volume, and especially Terje and Jana, who I worked with very closely in the process. And also I'd like to thank Erica and Peter for their contribution to this volume. I'm very proud to be a part of this book and to have included a chapter on the Sami migration narrative, which is very often left out of the narrative of migration to North America. So to begin with, as an Indigenous Studies scholar, it's important that I locate myself in relation to kinship and place. I am both Sami and American, and both of them all of the time. My father is Norwegian coastal Sami from West Finnmark, from Aksjevotna or Øksfjord, and Lakkavotna or Langfjord, and my mother is Anglo-American from the American Midwest. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is on the unceded lands of the Dakota people. And I've been living in Sápmi collectively for 13 years. And Sápmi is the Sami people's home, not just in the north, but also in areas, South Sami areas, south of the Arctic Circle. Many people think it's only above the Arctic Circle, but Sápmi is a very large area. So I'd like to begin my talk in Sápmi and what set Sami immigrants apart from their Nordic neighbors in the great periods of migration. So this is going to expound some on my chapter in the anthology, and my chapter derives from my PhD research on narratives of early 20th century Sami migrant women, which I submitted in 2018 and defended in 2019, so it's just been over a year. So this is a map of Sápmi, created by the Sami artist Hans Ragnar Mathisen, known among the Sami as Ellehanse. And the places marked are where the 5 women from the study come from in Sápmi. And they're all from the Norwegian side of Sápmi. But you cannot see the borders on this map, which is its decolonial potential. So what was happening at the time that these women migrated? Well, all of the women left Sápmi between the years 1906 and 1917, which is during the period of Norwegianization, which was a colonial assimilation policy. They all would have had some kind of experiences with this policy, especially in the schooling system, which was an assimilationist system, where they were not allowed to speak Sami. Many places they were not allowed to speak Sami. They were supposed to give up their Sami culture and become good Norwegians. Colonialism always relies on racialization of the peoples who are colonized. So in the Norwegian Sami context, it was part and parcel to nation building, to racialize the Sami. In order for Norway to build an ethno-national identity, it was important to define what Norwegians were not, and they were not Lapps. Lapps is a historical term which is not used today by the Sami people themselves. But it's very coded, and it has a lot of racial overtones. So the process of sort of creating Lapps mirrors in many ways how whiteness became operative in the United States as a measurement of what Europeans or white Europeans were not. So one other feature of life in Sápmi at the time, so we have assimilation policy, we have racialization, was that there was also class stratification, which is not nearly as pronounced today. And all of these women would have been affected in some way by this class stratification. In other words, none of them would have been a part of the gentry or part of the middle class. Most of them would be considered at the lower tier of the class stratification hierarchy. Another important aspect of several of them, of their lives, is Lestadianism and the Kautokeino uprising of 1852, which also affected the perceptions of the Sami in northern Sami and North Norwegian communities. Several of the women in the study were directly affected by the events of 1852, and several of them had very strong ties to Lestadianism or to other state church dissenter movements. So what is the trajectory of Sami settlement in North America? As you can see from the map, Sami people settled alongside other Nordic settlers. We can generally speak of two different experiences of Sami settlement, both of which are reflected in the study and in the book. The most famous Sami migration narrative is about the Alaskan Sami. This was a group of reindeer herding families from Guoldagatno or Kautokeino, Karashoka or Karashok, who were recruited to work in Alaska to teach the Inupiaq reindeer herding, the art of reindeer herding. And there was a lot of migration back and forth between Alaska, Poulsbo, Washington State, as you can see on the map, and also on Sápmi. So there was movement. With this group, there was a lot of movement between these three locations. But importantly, even though this is the most sort of famous group, they represent a very small fraction of the number of Sami people that migrated to North America during the waves of migration from the Nordic countries. They're a very small number of people. The overwhelming majority of Sami who came to North America came to the lower 48 states. And there's a number that kind of has been used a lot in the North American context, which is that there are at least 30,000 descendants of Sami migrants living in North America today. That number it's not clear where it came from, but it's been repeated by multiple people and also by scholars multiple times. So as you can see, the places on the map mark sort of the concentrations of Sami settlement. And these are areas where you will also find Nordics. They oftentimes settled alongside Nordic peoples. You will not find very many Sami who moved to North Dakota. There are possibly a few families, but there wasn't a concentration of them. And one of the reasons for that is, like the Finns, many Sami were recruited to work in mining and logging. Others worked in fisheries, especially in the Pacific Northwest. And the reasons why they left Sápmi were varied, but we can say with some degree of certainty that some of them left as a result of traumatic experiences at home. It's pretty impossible to consider that they were undergoing an intense policy of assimilation, a Norwegianization policy, and this is after 500 years of other forms of oppression, to think that they left for the exact same reasons as Norwegians. It's just quite likely that many of them actually left because of conditions they were experiencing at home. So we also have a very important issue that's thorny in the North American context, and that is that even though they had been racialized in Norway or in the Nordic countries, most of them, not everyone, most of them would have gained skin privilege upon coming to North America. However, in their local communities, amongst Nordics, they might have still continued to experience racialized othering. And there were still stereotypical and problematic representations of the Sami people that were circulating globally in various forms, both visual culture and also sort of encyclopedic and in novels and things. So it isn't that they completely escaped racialized othering or discrimination when they came to North America. They still would have felt this. So let's say a little bit about the people today, and that is the people who are the storytellers in my research. And in the book, who are they and what characterizes this community? Well, all of them have engaged in some kind of cultural revitalization. Most North Americans with Sami ancestry, although not all, there are no monolithic this isn't a monolithic community, it's very polyvocal. Most did not hear a lot about their Sami ancestry growing up. Now, it wasn't that it wasn't present. There were sort of, continuity in some ways, but it was very hidden. So a lot of times what they experience is through the act of remembering, then they're revitalizing. They remember things that their grandparents told them. They remember things. They remember stories. They remember stories that were told about photographs. So all of these things kind of work together. Revitalization, remembering, reclaiming, manifesting. What do you do with this? Let's say you reclaim this. You say, you know what? I'm not really that Swedish. I'm not really that Norwegian. I'm actually Sami. And what do you do with this information? So a lot of people will learn some of the language. They will, rather than saying the place name of where their grandmother came from, they might say it in Sami. And this becomes a really important sort of way of reclaiming a Sami place that they're connected to. They do a lot of genealogy, find out who they're related to in Sápmi. They might connect with relatives, although because of continued assimilation in the Nordic countries, many people will be, they meet family members that also don't identify as Sami, but their ancestors would have, all of their ancestors would have at one time. So what they're really doing is sort of suturing together a ruptured past through remembering. And they often draw on memory to try to make sense of their grandparents' experiences after having been silenced. And their grandmothers had complex reasons why they did not state outright that they were Sami. They were caught up in forces that were outside of their control, but descendants also draw on memory as a way to understand the subtle ways that Sami cultural belonging was expressed. And this they do oftentimes in community with other Sami diaspora descendants, or what has been called Sami Americans. And I would say that they live, what should we say, a complicated whiteness. They have a consciousness of social justice as involuntary beneficiaries of white supremacy. And for the descendants in this study and many others, liberation of all oppressed peoples connects to liberation or social justice for their ancestors, and by extension, people living in Sápmi. So I can't really speak for Jewish diaspora in North America, but when I read the life narratives of Ashkenazi Jews from Europe, whose ancestors oftentimes repressed their Jewish heritage upon coming to North America, I often see parallels. But the thing about the Sami diaspora is that it's important to say this is a lowercase d. This is not a classic diaspora of forced deterritorialization or forced departure. It's a much more complicated way of using diaspora, it has to do with that they're not reclaiming a place that's a European nation state. It's Sápmi that you're reclaiming. So this takes you very much outside of the nation state as a sort of framing, as the framing of your identity. So obviously the overwhelming majority, now there are some exceptions, but the overwhelming majority of Sami diaspora would live as their white passing in a very color-based racial regime, like in the US. And since many Americans like to sort of excavate their whiteness by making false claims to indigenous identities, there are unfortunately many people in North America who make false claims to Sami heritage. And a lot of this is tied into New Age movements. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but it's very relevant in this community. So when you have a white passing, that is in the American context, when you have a people or descendants of immigrants who were white passing, but they're indigenous, and there are people seeking to co-opt or appropriate an indigenous identity that isn't their own, we're sort of an easy target in a sense. So this has been an ongoing problem in the Sami American context. So what is diasporic indigeneity? This is how I've termed it, along with, I've consulted others in the Sami American community. And this is how I've contextualized it in my research. And this is kind of an emerging concept, which is used oftentimes for peoples who have moved from an area that is considered their sovereign territory and they move to a city. But in this context, these are people who have moved a long time ago, four generations ago. And what does it mean for their descendants? So this is kind of a term that a concept that's developing, and I think it can mean many things. So in this context, I have drawn on both James Clifford, who refers to the zone of relational contrast between diaspora and indigenous, and also looking at some other scholars who have really used this concept. So in the North American context, diasporic indigeneity in the Sami North American context is an expression of identity that disrupts the totalizing discourses of the nation state. Diasporic consciousness redresses assimilationist policies like Norwegianization and European nationalism, both of which effectively silenced indigenous identity in Sápmi and significantly in North America. So that's just a very brief overview of some of the theoretical issues in my dissertation, and that maybe aren't explicated so much in the chapter, which deals most significantly with racialization. And then I would like to say I'd like to introduce you a little bit to the women who are represented in the chapter and who will be represented in my dissertation, but also in other upcoming publications. In a way, I want people to be able to see images of them, sort of humanizes them beyond this kind of static text. So, Nilsdatter Bals, she's most likely, this is the photograph of her, I'm 98% sure. And Lukker Anne Mortensdatter Nilima, the two of them arrived in North America very close, both in 1907, within 6 weeks apart. They were both going to Alaska. And this Lap Immigrant is the title of the photograph that was given by the Museum of Ellis Island at the Museum of Immigration. So this is part of the Sherman collection. Maybe people have probably seen this photograph. It's quite famous. And Anne Nilima, or Lukker Anne, which actually means the daughter of the church sexton. She moved to Alaska as well in 1907. Both of these women went to Alaska in 1907. And the Karen Marie Nilsdatter, she is from Orporte or Hattfjelldal. She's the only South Sami in the study. And she also moved to Duluth. She moved to Duluth in 1904, I believe. And here she is pictured. The photograph on the left is of her still living in Norway. both of them are while still living in Norway. Yeah. The one on the left is from her confirmation, and the one on the right is obviously from her wedding to Knut Bohn. And this is Berit Susanna Kristina Larsdatter. She was from Troms province, or what today is now Troms og Finnmark. Not far from Tromsø. She's from Nordlandangen. It's called Itavatna in Sami. And the photograph on the right is her great-granddaughter, who was the storyteller. And I've included this just because I just think it's such a wonderful photograph. And I like how she's kind of looking over at her great-grandmother or her great-grandparents. And this is Albertina Josefine Svensson. She was from Artny or Arnøy in Troms, also in northern Troms. The photograph on the left you will hear about in a short film clip. And the photograph on the right is Albertina and her husband Ivar and their son Rudolf. And this was right not long before Ivar left for North America or moved to Duluth, and then later Albertina and Rudolf joined them later. He went by Rudy. So then I would like to say just a little bit before I end here, and we'll just see this little film clip, a little bit about my methodology. A lot of my material also intersects with photographs. So photographs and short videos and narrative. So I was looking at transmediality and how stories, oral stories, intersect with photographs. And then of course we have, the video as well. So you will see in the video kind of how photographs really inspired storytelling and how they function not only as material culture, but also as kind of history and a historical document. So here is a story about Albertina and that photograph told by her grandson. And I should also say that one of the reasons why I love to include this particular video is because it transpired between several descendants, and I have several videos from this meeting where you see how when Sami diaspora descendants get together, they're sort of doing this memory work to try to understand what was happening at the time that their grandmothers left Sápmi for America. So this isn't something that everyone does in isolation. There are people who really try to reach out to others and make meaning of this history together as a collective.
So I have to tell about the photograph, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's start with Albertina Josefine Svensson. She was a maid and a servant, and all of the young people were going to, they were going to go out and have a picnic. And the mistress of the household, in an evil way at the last minute said, "No, I want you to do this for me." So she was not able to go out with her friends on this boat trip and have a picnic on some island. And it really pissed her off. So after she did this chore, which was insignificant, she put on her best clothes, she went to town, and she had a photographer take a picture of her. And you can see a bit of her anger and bitterness in
Yeah.
her eyes.
She is very pretty. I think she is too. Did she leave after that then? Very short
Well,
after.
you know, my one grandmother was an indentured servant from age 5, and Albertina was from age 7.
It just sounds so awful.
Because her father had died, and her mother had to go work as a maid, and she worked for her another member of her family.
So that concludes my short presentation. And I hope that this inspires people to buy the book and read the chapter and consider the particular experiences of Sami people who moved to America, and especially Sami women. And I also wanted to say one last thing about resilience, and that is that Sami women who moved to North America did what they had to do to survive. So they would not want us to be viewing them as victims, even though they had multiple forms of domination that they had to grapple with. It's a very important sort of foundational value or foundational ontology in the Sami people's way that resilience is sort of built in. So I think it's important that I leave you with, remembering that these women were survivors, and they lived the best. They created a life with what they had, and they gave a lot to their descendants. So I guess I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much. Ologitu.